It's a death-defying life I lead. I take my chances. I die for living in the movies and TV.
You know, one of the best things about being an ex-big leaguer is getting freebies to the game. Call the front office, bingo. And once these fans recognize me, I probably won't even have to pay for my light beer from Miller.
Kind of like Bob Uecker, who made the joke about sitting in the front row, but ended up in the back row at the sporting events.
Good seats, huh?
You're in the wrong seat, buddy. Come on.
Oh, I must be in the front row.
I feel like I'm one of those guys that's never had the deep pockets to get those seats on the front row, but today's guest is always on the front row, Mike Kennedy, and he's joining us for this Off the Grid interview where we talk about his life and career. A lot of it, obviously, in broadcasting. He's the play-by-play voice of the Wichita State Shockers and has had an incredible career. He's had one of the longest streaks without missing a game in the United States, and has just kind of had a remarkable career as a broadcaster for Wichita State. Interesting learning about other aspects of his life too. So let's kind of get a little better seat and learn more about Mike Kennedy. All right, well, thanks, Mike, for sitting down on Off the Grid, as we call it here. So tell us about, you know, I've listened to so many times of you interview people after a game or before the game. So interviewing you, I don't know as much about you as I should. And so where'd you grow up? Did you grow up in Wichita?
I did, yeah, all the way. I was born here, elementary and middle school, high school here in Wichita State, and I didn't leave Wichita until my first job in broadcasting, which was in Chanute, Kansas, after the end of college.
So Chanute. So wait, were you in sports, or what were you doing in Chanute?
Yeah, I actually majored in vocal music at Wichita State. Had some ambitions to sing, and it was kind of like my athletic career where I was pretty good but not good enough to make a career out of that. And so I kind of got the broadcasting thing in my head way back, even kind of subconsciously. And my last year and a half at Wichita State, I took a class over at the campus radio station, KMUW, and back then it was a low power signal, and the students got to do a lot of stuff on air, and we did a bunch of games. We did all the Wichita State home football and basketball games. They had a freshman team then that we did, and then we talked them into letting us do the City League High School double and triple headers in basketball that were at the arena. So I got a lot of experience doing that and started sending out tapes, and I landed that job in Chanute doing sports. I also had to do some sales and other stuff, but yeah, primarily sports.
So at Wichita State, that was your first time you ever called a game? Do you remember that first game?
I do. In fact, I still drive by there once in a while and smile. That was the last year that Wichita State had a baseball program before they dropped it and before Gene brought it back like 8 years later. And my first game was a Wichita State Creighton baseball game at McAdams Park, over, was on 13th Street or whatever. And yeah, it was interesting. I mean, I kind of got going, and then I realized, I'm not talking enough. People can't see this. And so I even remember how it ended. Creighton won the game on a bases-loaded walk in the ninth inning to a guy named Gil Passarella, who went on to play at the Yankee organization for 4 years.
That's a pretty good memory. Bad memory. The thing we lost, but you remembered.
I guess that's how distinctive it was to me that I remember, that about it.
So when you were little, when I was a little kid, so I grew up near Cincinnati, and I can remember being 8 years old, listening to the radio. Marty Brenneman and Joe Nuxall, they were the announcers, longtime announcers, and they were like part of our family. And so as a kid, you're saying you kind of had maybe some thoughts about, or when you were younger, announcing. Was there announcers or radio announcers that you listened to growing up that made an impression on you like that?
First of all, I've always told this story. I don't know why exactly, but there was a connection for me. My Christmas of 1957, so I had just turned 9 years old. I got my first basketball and basketball goal for Christmas and a crystal set radio. And most people now have no idea what that even was, but it was a real simple little radio unit. You had a cardboard thing with a dial. You could actually dial it, and you could get the local radio station. There was some copper wire on it, and I don't really know how it worked. And there were no speakers. You plugged in these hard plastic headphones, and so it was great. I could listen to basketball games when I was supposed to be asleep, laying in bed. And I think my parents knew that, but so I had this correlation between sports on the radio and everything right from the beginning. And I'd listen to KU, K-State, and Wichita State, all those games. I guess the first actual name that registered, Harry Carey was the longtime voice of the Cardinals. And so I listened to Cardinal games, and I had a couple of uncles and a great uncle that were Cardinal fans that listened to Harry all the time. So we'd have those conversations about things Harry said and so forth. So that's kind of how it started.
Yeah, today everything is somehow televised, whether online or TV, and people forget. I mean, I'm old enough to remember that the Reds being on TV was a rare thing, so you had to listen to the radio to listen to your team.
Yeah, and in my era, there was the game of the week, and it was one game on Saturday. CBS, originally with Dizzy Dean and Buddy Blattner, and then NBC came on when I was still pretty young, 57, I think, with a game. But that was kind of it. And as far as like Wichita State on TV, I can remember, I can't that far back, 50s, and early 60s, there'd be an occasional game on, but it might be 3 or 4 a year was all.
And Wichita State in the 60s had a great, that was kind of their first time, the first breakout of Wichita State basketball, Final Four teams, and really great.
Exactly.
And do you remember any of those?
Oh, you remember that? Yeah. My parents had football season tickets for a number of years, and even into the first few years that I was around. And then I think with 2 kids and all of that, they just couldn't afford to keep them. But my dad would take me to a couple of football games a year and maybe 3 or 4 basketball games a year. So I got to see some in person when I was pretty young, and then followed it on the radio and so forth. But yeah, I mean, even back to the late 50s, I have very specific memories of, following those games and so forth.
You mentioned Wichita State football. Where were you when they had the plane crash?
I had started, that was the year that I had started doing stuff at the campus radio station, and there were a handful of us just hanging around there on that Friday afternoon. And I think we might have been, if not the first, some of the very first people to hear about it, because somebody went up to the AP wire machine. The Associated Press had put out something about it, and then came back shortly after and said, "Do not use this. This is embargo." They hadn't got clearance to actually put it out, but we saw what had happened, and so we started trying to figure out what we needed to do. They sent me over to the administrative offices to see if they had any information about which plane. We knew there were 2 planes, and if they had any information on who was on which plane and all of that. Which they didn't. And when I went back to the station, we were starting to get tons of calls. So I spent a couple hours on the phone just fielding phone calls from other campus radio stations, and a lot from Ohio, where there were players and coaches on the team from Ohio. And so it was family members, friends, people just trying to find out if anybody knew anything about what was going on.
So you were obviously young at that time. What was it like trying to be professional, but also this was a traumatic thing for the university? And like, was that hard to balance the two? Because that was such a significant thing here.
As I recall, yeah, I mean, it was just surreal, first of all. And I'll never forget walking across campus, and campus on Friday afternoons is probably still that way, but it was just dead. I mean, nobody around. It was just by myself walking across campus. Absolutely perfect early October day, just absolutely gorgeous. And I guess it was somewhat that way in Colorado, where it happened too. And I'll never forget that just seems so weird that something that awful could happen on a beautiful day like this. And I think, answering the phone calls and all of that, it just kind of went by so fast. You didn't really have much time to think about it. It really sunk in after the other plane got back, when we had started having the ceremonies on campus and that type of thing, that it really sunk in. But to this day, that's still something that's very vivid with me and with my wife, Debbie, when she was at the Alumni Association.
I was going to say, this year I went to the memorial, and you got to speak at the memorial on October 2nd this year.
And she really got to know the players who have come back, and one particular year was one of the major anniversaries. There were at least, I think, 4 or 5 of the survivors, and they asked her if she had a place where they could just get together and talk. So they went back to the Alumni Association, and it turned out that they had never had the opportunity. This was like 40 years, but never had the opportunity to just sit down and talk among themselves about how it felt to them. They hated the word survivor. They always had that feeling when they'd come back for those ceremonies and stuff. They had some guilt feelings that, that why me, survivor guilt day, and finally had a chance to kind of talk it out. And then, over time, Debbie took a couple of trips with people to the Christ site. I went along on those, and so we've kind of done all of that and met people and kind of connected with people that were involved in some way or another. So it has stayed with us all this time.
And next year will be 55 years. And I've gone to the crash site too. And if anybody's not been there, it's a remarkable place to visit.
I'm sure you can echo this. It's hard to describe all the different feelings that you go through. It's terrible and beautiful all at the same time. And the one trip, one of the players who was a freshman that year, had not been on the trip, who was part of the team, we got up there and he kind of walked around a little bit and he said, it's like they've been waiting for us, and just that kind of thing. So that first time we went, and I guess it's changed. At the time, it was like a national site of some kind, and you weren't supposed to leave anything there. And Debbie and her staff had taken a bunch of sunflowers, and they had buttons made up with the names of all of the people that had died. And so if any family members, anybody had a particular connection, could have one of those. And people started laying sunflowers on the wreckage and then pinning those pins to the wreckage. And the Alpine Rescue Team had helped us, go up there and all that. And when we got ready to leave, she said to one of them, please don't take any of this stuff off until we're down the mountain. He said, ma'am, nobody's touching anything. Yeah. Now I guess there's stuff there all the time that people have been able to leave.
So then you went to Chanute after that. So what was it? What did you do between leaving Wichita State and coming back to Wichita State?
And first of all, the Chanute story, I think, is kind of a interesting one, a fun one, because after the plane crash, they resumed the football season, what they called the second season. And I did play-by-play of a game here with North Texas, and a guy named Don Gilly returned a kickoff 108 yards for a touchdown for Wichita State. And that was on my audition tape that I sent out. And the owner of the radio station in Chanute had been at a broadcasters convention in Wichita, and they came to the game that Saturday. He had seen the play and thought I described it well, and that's basically what got me the first job there. So I was there for about 2 years, and then I went to Pittsburgh and was there for about 2.5. I did Pittsburgh State, and it was a station with a big power, a 10,000-watt signal. So there was another station in town that did Pittsburgh high school games, so I did a lot of games all around the area and smaller towns that didn't have their own radio station and that sort of thing. So
when I do these small town videos in southeastern Kansas, you're probably familiar with every quite a few.
So, yeah, and certainly it was different. It was challenging, and I'm a stat guy. There were no, you couldn't go into a high school and they'd hand you a stat sheet or whatever. So what I started doing, we got all the area newspapers at the station. Since it was a big signal station, they tried to do news coverage of the whole area. So they subscribed to all the newspapers. So I'd get the newspapers and figure up stats on all the teams that we might do, at least scoring average and that sort of thing from the newspaper coverage. And so it was a lot to do. There was a lot to cover.
And then around 1980, come back.
Actually, 1976.
Okay, so
the thing that I had decided I wanted to do when I got into broadcasting was eventually do Major League Baseball. I mean, the baseball play-by-play was kind of my first thing. And so I was looking for a minor league situation. It happened that one opened up back here in Wichita, and so I ended up getting that job. I came back in January of 1976. I worked for the ball club, did did the games, and then at the end of that season, or toward the end of the season, sports director from Cake TV came to me. And at the time, it was Cake Radio and TV, and they had just acquired the contract to broadcast Wichita State. And part of that was there just always been a very few games on TV, and Wichita State was trying to get more games televised, and the contract called for them to televise at least 8 games a year. So they asked me if I'd be interested in doing radio for the games that they televised and then anchor sports on the weekend. So I did that. That evolved into doing morning sports on Cake Radio. I did that for 4 years, and then the stations got split up. And it's crazy now when there are companies that own literally hundreds of radio and TV stations, but back then there was real concern with the FCC that ownership, like in Topeka, the same ownership owned the TV, WIBW TV and radio and the newspaper. And they were concerned that that would allow somebody to dominate the coverage of things in any particular community. So when it got sold, they had to split the radio and TV. And the new owners of the radio station asked me if I would come be the full-time play-by-play voice, and that's 45 years.
Sir. And so what was the Wichita team named at that time, the baseball team?
They were the Wichita Arrows, or AEROS, and they were a Cubs affiliate for the first few years they were in existence. And then they went through several changes. The first 2 years, I did them off and on for 4 years. The first 2 years they were with the Cubs, and then 1 year with the Reds. So
I remember, the Arrows because of being a Reds fan, and my favorite player of all time growing up was Eric Davis.
And he was on their team for the first half or so of the season that I did their game. Eric Davis, Tom Browning, I'm sure you remember him. We got pretty good friends. And who else? Ron Robinson that was in the Reds rotation.
That was when I was a young kid. So I went to spring training in 1983 or 1984. I met all those players. Like Johnny Bench was at the end of his career, and there was, Pete Rose was coming shortly after that. So it was like part of the Big Red Machine, but it was all these new guys like Barry Larkin and some of, so that was when I grew up. It was interesting tying that to Wichita now.
That was 84, the year that I did their games. So yeah.
Okay, so Wichita State, play-by-play, you started doing. Did you initially do baseball and basketball? Was that the sports that you were doing?
Didn't do baseball right away. My first year was 80-81. I did football for the last 7 years that we had a football program, and basketball. And then in 82, they went to a regional in New Orleans, and I can't remember what the conversation was, but it worked out. They decided the radio station would send me down there to cover that regional. Well, they ended up winning that regional and going to the World Series for the first time. So I went on and did the World Series. The next year we did a few games. We did, I don't think we traveled. We did a few home games on radio and did a handful of games on one of the cable channels on TV. And then in 84, we didn't do any games at all. And then in 85, we started doing pretty much every game. And from then on, I've done baseball.
So baseball, if you're not a Wichita State person, you might not realize about the history of Wichita State baseball. But in the 80s, the program really started developing. And then obviously you're the guy when they win the one and kind of only national championship in Wichita State history. And I'm guessing you get asked that a lot, but what was calling that moment? Like, so many people have heard you call it, but what were your feelings in the moment when that was happening?
I had an experience with that I've never had any other time in all these 40 plus years. Because that team went through quite a bit. At the end, we went to the regional at Fresno, and Mike Lansing, who was an All-America caliber shortstop, went down with a back injury in batting practice before the regional started. So he was out. We lost the right fielder, Jeff Bonaquista, toward the end of the season to a knee injury. And Bryant Winslow came up with a stress fracture in his foot, and they had to come out of the loser's bracket, play the host, Fresno State, with about a 2-hour turnaround to stay alive in the tournament, then beat Michigan twice to win the regional, and then the same thing at Omaha. They lost their second game to Florida State, had to come back through the loser's bracket. So At the end of the championship game, we go to a break and we come back and start talking about it. And it just kind of sunk in, all the stuff they'd been through and overcome. And I got choked up. I actually teared up. And that has never, ever happened to me any other time in a broadcast. And Casey Scott, who was working with me, noticed and he kind of took over. And then he started choking up, and I was able to recover and get it back. So that's how emotional it was. And there was the excitement because the last out was a strikeout to end the game. And people have probably heard that call. I was very excited. But then afterward, just a total change in the way the emotion shifted a little bit.
Yeah. Wow, that's awesome. I was not here, but I remember that. So I don't know if I remember hearing your voice or just remember it on TV or ESPN or something. But yeah, I have memories even in living in Ohio of that Wichita State baseball team, and that was when I was in, I think, the 9th grade. So I was a big baseball fan. So that was when Wichita State won, that was a big deal. I just remember at a lot of places being beating the bigger teams. And Wichita State was kind of a major force in baseball. It's not like they were some minor team. That was a yearly thing to go to the College World Series.
And just the year before, they had been to like the semifinals, the last game to get into the championship game, and were playing Arizona State and had this guy struck out about 3 times in the game, and he kept fouling pitches off. In fact, one that he literally, the bat left his hands. He kind of threw the bat at it, fouled it off, and then got a base hit to send it into extra innings, and they won. So now you got a second championship game in that bracket, and they won like 18-1 or 18-2 or something like that. And so just a devastating end, but that ended up being an incentive for Wichita State the next years.
So I guess one of the next big moments, more modern moments, would be with the basketball team, beating Ohio State to go to the Final Four. And, I was coaching here at that time, and we had a track meet at the University of Arkansas, and our meet was ending as the game was beginning. And so we're in Arkansas going, we need to go see this game. And so we pile into some Fayetteville, Arkansas sports bar to have chicken wings and whatever terrible food they have with our track team, and watch that game with 100 shocker track and field athletes. It was obviously a memorable game. What was it like, one, winning the Final Four or being part of that, and then 2, the actual Final Four?
The first thing that I will never forget was on Selection Sunday, after the pairings were announced, and the Shockers, I think, were a 9 seed, we're going to play Pittsburgh. And I get a call from a Pittsburgh talk show, wanted me to be on. So I said, sure. So I get on, it was questions like, who did Wichita State play to get a 9 seed? It was obvious they were not happy with being an 8, and they didn't think Wichita State was much. And I said, well, they beat DePaul, which last time I checked was in your conference, and I named off a couple of others. And I was ticked by the time we got to the end of the interview. And I said, well, what do you think Wichita State's chances are? And I said, well, if the attitude within the Pittsburgh team is anything like what I've been hearing coming back from the other end of this, I think they're pretty good. And so after they beat Pittsburgh, they're facing Gonzaga, and that was just a heck of a win. And the thing that happened there that was really cool, of all the stuff that took place, the single most joyous, spontaneous moment was at the end of that game. There weren't that many people there because the year before, a pretty good number of people had traveled to Portland, and they got beaten the first round by PCU. And so not as many were willing to go. And the fans were right behind the Wichita State badge on into the floor, and then the band was around the corner at the end of the floor, and they started playing that "You Don't Want to Go to War with the Shockers." And the team and the coaches and everybody went over there to the end line in front of the band and were dancing and singing along with the band, and it was just a really cool moment. And then to go on to L.A., and you're in the Staples Center and all that, and at the end of the Ohio State game, it was... you knew in the last few seconds they were going to win, and we went to a break, and we came back, of course. And as we're going to the break, and I'm in between Bob Hull and Dave Dahl, and I'm looking at him going, "We're going to the Final Four." you understand what's happening here? Like they didn't, if we're going to the Final Four. I mean, it just was mind-boggling. And then the other really cool thing that happened is we were there pretty much after everybody was gone doing our post-game show, and they had all these ushers wearing red coats, and they had a meeting of some kind at the end of the court, probably just to go over, okay, here's how everything went. And several of them start walking down the middle of the court, and they started singing, "You don't want to go to war with the Shockers." That was a really, really cool thing, too.
So then what was the Final Four like?
It was in the...
Was that a different experience compared?
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had never been to a Final Four. It was in the old Georgia Dome, huge football type arena stadium, and just the scope of it was just off the chart. I mean, it's hard to imagine. The teams all had a regular practice somewhere, at like a high school or something, but they all had an hour practice time at the arena that was required. It was just kind of a glorified shoot around, and there were like 20-some thousand people in there watching these just sort of glorified practices. And then, I'd heard about, but hadn't experienced, you see all these people, famous names from basketball just showing up and sitting around you. And I saw Bill Russell in the airport, and just stuff like that. That was amazing. And the size of the arena, there was a media work area and stuff, and that's where they had the post-game interview thing set up and so forth. So we'd come in there and then head out to the arena floor, and I swear we probably walked close to a mile just to get out to where the arena floor was. It was that big, and so I've just never experienced anything like that.
Wow. So on February 15th, 2024, you had broadcast over 1,400 consecutive games. And in that time, can you think about how much you traveled?
Oh, yeah.
Is there any way to summarize, or is there any idea of how many miles you flew or drove or anything like that?
I've never tried to do that. And for many years, we traveled by, did commercial travel. And so then you're talking about connecting flights and different airports, and a lot of time sitting around in airports and all of that, and bus trips to, some of the valley places. But no, I never tried to calculate it or add it up. But I'm trying to think. There were two occasions in that streak that came real close to not happening. One, in 1986-87, we had a game at Minnesota right before Christmas, and then they were going to play in a 2-game tournament in Hawaii. And the team just went from Minneapolis to Hawaii, but there were a couple of days in between, and Dave Dahl and I flew home for Christmas, and then flew out the day after Christmas, and the first game was that night, the 26th. And we got to St. Louis. Everything was TWA through St. Louis back then, and we had some delays. And by the time we landed in Honolulu, we were getting really close to not making it. And we got our bags, jumped in a cab, told the guy, get us to Block Arena as fast as you can get there. And he took us at our word. It was a scary ride. He was just zipping in and out of traffic and way over the speed limit. And we walked into the gym, the building, I think maybe 15 or 20 minutes before we were supposed to go on the air, got our stuff set up and got it done. And then 2005, I believe, Wichita State had a pretty good season, but we weren't sure if it was going to continue. And I had a baseball trip scheduled to 2 games in midweek at Arizona State and then a weekend series at UCLA. And we talked about it. Besides, since we didn't know what was happening, keep the tickets, plan on going. Well, then that Sunday night, after the NCAA selections, they got picked to go to the NIT at Iowa State. So we figured, okay, go ahead, go to Phoenix, do the game on Tuesday night. And then I had a flight on Wednesday, which was the day of the game, back to Des Moines and through Denver. And Steve Sjogren, my partner, was going to drive up, pick me up at the Des Moines airport. We go up to Ames and do the game. I get up that morning, and I had like a 5:30 or 6 a.m. flight out of Phoenix. And they'd had this massive snowstorm in Denver, and the airport was shut down. So then we ended up getting I got another flight to Chicago, and the plan was to try to then catch a connecting flight from there to Des Moines. Well, everything was full with all the cancellations, all the flights were full. So my boss and his secretary had set up for me to pick up a car, and I drove in a driving rainstorm faster than was probably I should have, from Chicago to Des Moines, or to Ames. And we even had to arrange, we picked up part of the Iowa State pregame broadcast because I didn't get into the arena. I changed clothes in the car in the parking lot at Tilton Coliseum and walked in about 20 minutes before tip-off. So those kept the streak going. We're just barely.
I envision like in the end of the Hangover movie when they're flying down the highway and they're putting their tuxedos on trying to get to the way. It was kind of like that, felt that way. So I mentioned February 15th, 2024, because that was the day that if you go on our Go Shockers website, there's a announcement about you're going to miss the next couple games. And obviously you've been diagnosed with cancer and you were going to miss a couple games. And so I certainly want to ask how you're doing, but what was the emotions like of missing the games that you're going to miss?
First of all, it got picked up and I did a routine physical, and the blood test showed a high PSA, and so Debbie and I met with a urologist, and you could just tell from his experience, he felt like at that level it probably was, but they did the tests, found out for sure like 2 days before Christmas that I had prostate cancer. But it was combination of the worst type of cancer cells, but they felt it, the tests had shown it was isolated in a small area of the prostate, so they felt like they could really attack it. And so we started the process late January. Well, it came down to that trip to North Carolina would have caused me to miss some treatments. I was doing a treatment every day, every weekday, and my oncologist was actually kind of okay with, he understood, and if I wanted to go ahead and continue the streak, but I just felt like it's probably not the smartest thing to do. It would have extended it, a little farther, which would have gotten into the conference tournament then. I had to make another decision. So I just decided, as important as this streak has been to me and as proud of it as I am, I just need to do this. And I just felt like I wouldn't have necessarily said anything, but if they'd said, well, Mike's not here for a medical reason, or then people are going to want to know what is it. And plus, I just don't like, having never missed a game in 44 years, that some explanation was probably necessary. So we prepared the statement that you were talking about. I was on the pregame show with Shane Dennis and Bob Hull to explain. And I thought also, maybe it was important, maybe I could do some good to say, early detection is what's giving me a chance to come through this. And I just thought that might be helpful. So I thought that was important. But going into that evening and missing the first game I'd ever missed, I was just dreading. And then when that message went out, my phone blew up for like 2 hours with people texting and emailing, and especially a lot of former student athletes, which really meant a lot to me. I sent something about thank you for whatever, and he said, hey, the way you picked us up when we were playing, we certainly need to do the same for you. That kind of thing meant a lot to me. So it ended up honestly being one of the best nights of my life.
I think that, like I mentioned at the beginning, listening to the Reds and how they almost felt like part of our family, did you realize your effect on maybe the people of Wichita, that you, with your just consistency through the years of how much a part of their family you've always been?
Maybe. People have said a lot of nice things over time, and I appreciate that. To me, the relationships that you develop with these young people, with the student athletes, I know at coaching, obviously that has to be as important to you as anything. And certainly that's what's stuck with me, and all the relationships, the people I've worked with, the coaches I've worked with, that's what really become all the great moments that I've had a chance to describe. The relationships and those memories are what really stay with you. And so that meant a lot. And I guess to feel like that to some of those student athletes, that relationship and the ongoing relationship was as important to them as it has been to me. That was very, very gratifying.
And you look like you're doing well and feeling good.
I'm doing great. The radiation was about 5 weeks, And other than that, I'm taking a pill every night. It's hormone therapy to keep the testosterone reduced because that's what the cancer has a tendency to attack. And I've got to do that for another year and a half or so. But I mean, all things considered, I was never really in any pain or any particular discomfort. And I had a meeting with both my urologist and my oncologist in September, and they'd, done the lab work. And my PSA was close to 13 when they discovered it was 0.08 September. So essentially close, or am as close to cancer-free as I can be. And I felt good through the whole thing, so.
And you got a new streak going?
Yeah, I think it's 9 games or something like that.
So kind of wrapping up the Wichita State part of this, do you ever step back? I mean, maybe this interview is one way to do it, but do you ever step back and go, man, I have seen a lot of stuff. Think of how many presidents and how many athletic directors, and the one constant has been Mike Kennedy, and is there anyone, I don't know if there's anyone else that would be from 1976 to current days that's been here. I don't know, Gretchen, maybe how do you check about general? Well, they're not quite, yeah. But do you ever step back and think, man, this has been awesome, or this, I can't believe it, or are you so in the moment that sometimes you don't have a chance to really think about it like that?
Some of both. I mean, there are times when I just start thinking about things, like you say, that I've experienced or places I've been and that sort of thing, and it kind of hits home. Paul Mills asked me before we did our first pregame interview this year, he said, back when you started, did you ever think you'd be heading into a season in 2024-25, that kind of thing. And no, I don't know that I think probably back then I would have thought if I did 20 or 25 years of this, that would really be something. So,
well, you speak of Paul Mills, we have a good start to the season. Hopefully we can keep it going. It seems like maybe they're turning the corner this year.
I believe so. It's a more talented, deeper team than it was a year ago, and more capable of playing the way he likes to coach. And I think also, I would say probably any coach, a group of coaches would tell you, when you come into some place the very first year, and usually if there's a hire, it's because somebody has left at the end of the previous season, which means recruiting's almost over. I mean, there's not going to be a lot out there that you can go out and get. And so some of it's just how you can deal with the returning players and how you mesh, and you do the best you can, but they're not guys you recruited. And I think now he feels like they have people that are all on board with what they're trying to do. And so that's certainly a positive. And I think he's an outstanding coach. In all these 40 plus years that I've been around here, I just believe that Wichita State has the best overall group of coaches in all the sports that I've ever seen here, and good people. I mean, just good people that interact well with each other, support each other. I think it's a great environment from that standpoint.
So, final question. You've traveled so many places. Is there anywhere you want to travel that you've never traveled before?
Debbie and I have talked about that, because at some point in the foreseeable future, we're going to retire, and we're not, I don't know that we'll ever be big international travelers. I was in Europe a little bit just before my senior year at Wichita State. I went with the university singers we were in France and Austria and Switzerland a little bit, and it'd be kind of cool to go back. I mean, there's some beautiful places over there. But I mean, we were just talking the other day, I've never been to the Grand Canyon. I mean, with all the traveling I've done, I've never really been to the Grand Canyon. I've never really been in New England much. I'd like to experience that, especially maybe in the fall or something. The giant redwoods in California, there's just things like that. And I told you before we started this interview, I've always been intrigued by the Route 66 experience, and I've always thought that might be something I'd like to try sometime.
Absolutely. Route 66 is really cool. I did it 4 years ago, and growing up in Ohio, I had a lot of places I obviously had never been, and you fly over them, but you never really see all these little towns, and you think about what they used to be. And it's unusual now because some of them are still frozen in time, but some of them are abandoned, and there's just a lot of interesting history. And obviously you've seen a lot of interesting history.
I've been some places, like I've driven from Illinois State back to St. Louis to the airport, and some of that interstate parallels the old Route 66. I have an uncle that lives in Rolla, Missouri, and I've been back there where I've actually driven down some of the old Route 66 through town and out into the country a little bit, like to an antique store or something. And there's interstate that parallels that, of course, now too. But I've seen little bits of it. We used to go to Amarillo for West Texas State when they were in the league, and so I've seen just a little touch of it there. So it's just always, I'm a history buff. It's always kind of intrigued me a little bit.
I tell people that it's interesting from Chicago to, Oklahoma, but I feel like west of Oklahoma City is where it's really what you think of Route 66, and the really gets spread out and spaced out, and the little towns, then there's just desolate, miles and miles of road. And you could imagine being in the 1940s driving with some dream to get to California, and here's a town that pulls up and there's just a guy working at a gas station, and just different time than obviously now you just zoom right past it or just fly right past it. So yeah. So anyways, I encourage you to do that. Route 66 in 2026 is going to be the 100-year anniversary, so maybe that could be,
But never know. And that's something, it's one of those things I've never quite dealt with it enough to say, would I ever really do that? And I think it's actually something that Debbie might go along with doing with me. So, I mean, that she has that kind of sense of adventure too. So who knows, maybe.
Well, thanks for chatting. We've known each other for a long time, but there's a lot of stuff I just never asked. I should have asked a long time ago. So I'm glad I had this opportunity to sit down and ask you these questions.
It's been fun to talk about. Thank you.
Thanks for making it all the way to the end of this video on Tuesday. Tuesdays are a little different around here. We call them off-the-grid videos because they're just not normal videos that we put out normally traveling. These are sometimes interviews, sometimes maybe a highlight video, a drone video, something that's just different than Thursday and Sunday, but we have a lot of fun putting those together. You can become a member on our YouTube channel here on Patreon or YouTube. Executive producers, and supporters, there's different levels. Everyone gets different perks depending on what level they're on. A lot of fun we have there with extra videos, behind the scenes content, always new stuff coming out weekly in the member only section. You can go to travelwiththewiseguy.com. There are all kinds of things on there to check out. You can go to a link to get some merchandise. You can go find the Google map that has a pin dropped of every place I've done a video about, and kind of do your own little adventure there. There's things like my newsletter you can sign up for that's totally free. Lots of interesting extras on the website, travelwiththewiseguy.com. Once again, thanks for making it to the end of the video, and I really, really, truly appreciate your support.
Good seats, hey, buddy. He missed the tag. He missed the tag.